Okay, how's that, Jay?
Perfect.
Can you see it?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're on the West Coast, and greetings from the Heartland. I'm Collin Wamsley with the Missouri Department of Agriculture. I've been the state entomologist here since 2007. So we've had conversations in the Central Plant Board over the last 2 or 3 years about thousand cankers disease and possible deregulation. And I got to tell you, I've had some apprehension about this presentation over the last couple of weeks, and partly just because there's this surreal feeling of we've spent so much time and effort on this over the last 12 years at least, trying to figure out what we're dealing with, enacting quarantines, and getting as much information as we can from the all the researchers that were involved in this. So it's just kind of an odd feeling to come full circle now and to be talking deregulation. But I kind of feel like there's 3 different paths we go with invasive forest pests. And we heard about Asian longhorn beetle today, and we know that there's success stories with that. It can be eradicated. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's things like emerald ash borer, where right from the beginning, we were always so far behind that one. And, I know all of us are very frustrated with all the effort that we put into it, but we were always kind of behind on that one, even though we've made some great strides and there's been a lot of great work on it, particularly with, just outreach about the pathways involved, and then just the biological control work that's going on now. But then somewhere in the middle is thousand cankers disease, and there's other pest examples, but it's, we started out initially and we were seeing stories and pictures out of the western states of how devastating this was on black walnut. But then as the years went on, we found that maybe this isn't going to be as bad as we initially thought it would be. So if anything, I think that's a very positive thing, and we're good at putting up regulations, but sometimes we're not as good at removing them when they need to be removed. So we've had a lot of conversations about this in the Central Plant Board, but also beyond it with the eastern states about this over the last few years. And so here we are. So I'm going to talk about just initially here a quick timeline of how things played out kind of from the first few years with thousand cankers disease. And so around 2004, maybe a couple of years before that, we were seeing a lot of die-off of black walnuts in Colorado, and in particular the city forester for Boulder, Kathleen Alexander, was really raising the alarm with what she was seeing there in Boulder with wide-scale die-off of black walnut. But even before that, we were seeing a lot of dieback in some of the southwestern states, like in New Mexico in the early to mid 1990s. In 2008, then Ned Tisserat with Colorado State University and some of his colleagues were able to actually characterize the pathogen that was involved in the thousand cankers disease complex as Geosmithia morbida. And really, probably the first that I remember hearing about this was on the ornamental entomology list server that Whitney Cranshaw with Colorado State moderates. And I know at that Central Plant Board meeting in Iowa in 2009, we were all starting to talk about it a lot more. And then so later in 2009, PPQ did a really nice pathway assessment of thousand cankers disease, and that came out just right before we hosted a thousand cankers disease national conference in St. Louis, and it was really kind of our first national attempt at getting researchers together and as regulators trying to learn what this disease complex is and what we needed to do about it. So in the winter of 2009, 2010, a lot of the concerned states had a series of conference calls to try to figure out what the feasibility was of enacting state-level quarantines for thousand cankers disease. And we got a lot of great input from Forest Service researchers, such as the late Dr. Stephen Seibold, who really was, I would consider him our science advisor to the Central Plant Board on this issue, but many others with the Forest Service and with other universities and with PPQ. And so Julie Van Meter drafted the first model thousand cankers disease quarantine that a lot of us modeled our state regulations off of. And so spring of 2010, we started enacting those state level quarantines. So prior to the, all of this was, thousand cankers disease was known out west, where black walnut is not native. But it was in around July of 2010 that thousand cankers disease was discovered in Knoxville, Tennessee, right in the middle of the native range of black walnut. And so that really got our attention. And it was discovered by a homeowner who noticed his nice big black walnut tree in his yard was starting to die back. And so folks there with Tennessee Department of Ag were able to identify that as thousand cankers disease. So, beyond that, past 2010, we implemented regulatory efforts and did a lot of outreach, and a lot of time has passed. And so, right before our national meeting in St. Louis, I took a picture of my daughters out on my parents' farm harvesting black walnuts, and just to see how much time has passed, they graciously agreed to pose for the photo again to recreate that in 2020. So a lot of time has passed over the last 12 years. We've done a lot of work and discovered a lot about thousand cankers disease. And so again, back kind of in the beginning, what we were seeing was really some scary pictures out of the West. This was in Golden, Colorado in 2010, and this was typical of urban street tree scenes where a lot of black walnuts were planted as street or yard trees and really dying back in large numbers. So this got our attention, of course. So in spring 2010, as I mentioned, a lot of states started enacting state-level quarantines, putting those in place. And this is the, I believe this is current, of what states have thousand cankers disease regulations right now. So I'll talk a little bit about the response that we had in Missouri, and this was very typical of all the states that were involved in thousand cankers disease response. But we enacted our quarantine in April of 2010, and then using that pathway assessment data that PPQ put together, we were able to do some mass mailings to walnut-related businesses in the western states and letting them know that we had quarantines in place and provided some outreach information about that. We're able in Missouri to use the Missouri Highway Patrol in enforcing our quarantines. And so we engaged with the commercial vehicle unit. And so any walnut shipments that were coming into Missouri and stopping at way stations, our Highway Patrol commercial vehicle unit could talk to those truckers, see what kind of commodities they were carrying, if it was in fact walnut, if it was a regulated article, and then gather data for us that we could follow up on. Did a lot of outreach to Missouri businesses in the forest products industry, but also some new types of organizations that we engaged with that were new to us, but hobby woodworkers. We've discovered over the last decade or more that this is really a key group when it comes to movement of invasive forest pests, because you can, as Dr. Russo just talked about, you can get on these e-commerce platforms and get just about anything, including live edge black walnut from the West Coast or other infested areas. So we engaged a lot with hobby woodworkers as well. We established a forest pest program coordinator position, and this person in part is responsible for our thousand cankers disease survey work, outreach, and also looking at the firewood pathway. So that position's been held by Sarah Phipps, formerly, who's now our state survey coordinator, and also currently Rosalie Knipp, who've done just tremendous work on thousand cankers disease in Missouri. We also do an annual intensive survey for walnut twig beetle and thousand cankers disease, and we partner with that on the Missouri Department of Conservation. And so between our two agencies, we're using state funding as well as now PPA 7721 funding and Forest Service funding for those surveys. And then we also developed the Missouri Invasive Forest Pest Council as we saw with emerald ash borer. We had a lot of interagency collaboration on that, but as new pests were coming on board, especially the threat of thousand cankers disease, we decided to form an umbrella group that would work on all of these forest pest issues together. And then finally, this was really our first foray into a forest pest disease that we might encounter here in Missouri that would be a large-scale threat, in addition to things like sudden oak death. So this was a way that we could really engage all of our various state plant pathology labs at University of Missouri, Department of Conservation, Lincoln University, and our own lab at the Department of Ag. So we were just kind of preparing for surge capacity and making sure our labs were working together and collaborating. So after all that response and preparation, then we started hearing out of some of the eastern states like Tennessee and elsewhere that they'd had really bad droughts in some of those states in 2010, and then that's when we started seeing thousand cankers disease in the east. But the following years had pretty good climate, adequate rainfall, and in particular, Dr. Griffin was doing a lot of observational work and noted that some known infested trees were actually recovering, flushing back out and holding their own. So this was a ray of hope. Some good news finally on the thousand cankers front. But then also some new information. Some of the work that Dr. Jenny Jeswick with the Forest Service was doing was screening other beetle species that we were capturing in walnut twig beetle traps, screening those other beetle species for Geosmithia morbida, and come to find out that it looks like Geosmithia is pretty widespread. Or in some states, we know in Missouri, it's in a lot of our counties based on screening some of our side catch from those walnut twig beetle traps. And Dr. Jeswick's work also noted similar results in some other states here, like Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, Michigan, and there may be other states where she did that work and had similar results. And then meanwhile, we're doing a lot of survey throughout Missouri and in other states. We feel like we've done pretty intensive survey in Missouri, and I know other states have done, even I think a higher level of intensity on their surveys. And, we just weren't seeing it here. We weren't seeing any walnut mortality. We weren't seeing walnut twig beetle at all. So again, some good news. So why deregulate? We had a lot of conversations in the Central Plant Board, as I mentioned, about possible deregulation. So we started having those conversations. And so what are the driving factors about considering actually rescinding a quarantine? And so with thousand cankers, what we were seeing in the eastern states where, a lot of the site conditions are really ideal for black walnut, it's where it's native. Where we were seeing detections or mortality were primarily in urban settings. We weren't seeing it in, native stands or managed walnut plantations or in nursery stock. It really just seemed primarily in urban sites where these really weren't ideal conditions. And then even then, it was just, following some of the extreme drought seasons that we've had in those areas. We've also seen the mortality, as I mentioned, is really following really severe drought events. We don't seem to see that mortality after, good years where there's adequate moisture. And again, Dr. Griffin's work, we're seeing evidence of trees rebounding after years of ideal weather conditions, and even, having difficulty finding walnut twig beetle in traps in areas where it's been confirmed previously. And then again, as mentioned, Geosmithia seems to be potentially widespread throughout the native range of black walnut. It's just, I've heard it described as a weak fungus, and these are annual cankers, and it really takes the mass attack year after year with walnut twig beetle to reinfest and cause new cankers, to get those, thousands of cankers in a tree. And then also, another consideration, and it's a significant consideration, is the regulatory burden that we're putting on our forest product businesses in light of this information that we've been seeing the last several years, where thousand cankers disease isn't potentially as bad as we thought that it might be initially. Continued survey, not quarantines, is the driver of international phyto restrictions. So the Central Plant Board and other states have talked with export services about what the possible implications would be on trade if we rescinded these quarantines, and they've emphasized that really it's not about our state level quarantines, it's about whether we're continually doing survey throughout our state to make sure that we don't have it, or that we can at least identify that it's not in certain areas. And then also, and this is a reality, there's other new, potentially more impactful pests in the pipeline, and we've certainly heard about some of those over the last couple of days: Asian longhorn beetle, spotted lanternfly, all the alphabet soup of new pests that we're dealing with, box tree moth, and others. And so there's a balance of using the limited resources that we have, and that's just the reality of our business. So what are the consequences of deregulation? They say that decisions have consequences, and so that's certainly the case in regulatory work. And so there are consequences for enacting regulations, and there are consequences for deregulating, and so we've got to weigh all of those things. So as far as deregulating, it's going to open up the unrestricted movement of walnut twig beetle, which is really the driving factor in thousand cankers disease. Again, we've talked with export services about international trade and how this might impact it, and even though we're told that it's really about the survey, there's still the potential of trade restrictions. So also, we talk about a warming climate and that trend, and that's more of a long-term and an unknown issue, but I know that's some of the concern in Missouri with some of the forestry folks here is what is the long-term impact with a warming climate trend, and how that's going to put more stress on our black walnut trees. And also, our TCD quarantines are our de facto firewood quarantine. We've heard that, I think, over the last couple of days, and that's certainly true. Emerald ash borer and thousand cankers quarantines, at least for the central states, have been our firewood quarantines, and so we won't have those anymore. And then finally, there's just the public perception that we've talked about this for over a decade now, and now we're pulling back and talking about deregulating. So there's that communication that has to happen, to drive that public perception in the right way. So finally, just wanted to talk about post-deregulation and what we need to consider. And really, as we're deregulating for those states that are going that way, I think one of the most important things we need to do is communicate with the plant board members how we're going to handle enforcement of our quarantines in that interim period. It takes some states, like for Missouri, once we file papers to rescind a quarantine, it takes 6 months for that to take effect. In some states, it's a year. So we need to really clearly communicate what we're going to do in that interim period. And so one tool that we have here in Missouri that some of our other divisions have used is a letter of intent that expresses that, we've filed the paperwork to rescind this regulation, and we do not intend to enforce this regulation during that interim period until it's rescinded. And so the communication there is really going to be key, so that exporting businesses in other states that are maybe shipping into our states have a clear picture of what's going to happen. Also for walnut exporting states, and also those states just concerned about thousand cankers disease and what it'll do to our native stands, it's going to be very important to continue surveying for walnut twig beetle and thousand cankers disease to help facilitate trade, and also just give our landowners and walnut folks an idea of where this thing is at. And also, we hope that PPQ would continue to fund 1,000 Cankers disease surveys through PPA 7721 to help facilitate international trade. And then finally, just communicating through the plant board and regional boards, new detections of walnut twig beetle and 1,000 Cankers disease. So again, we know where this thing is at. And so over the last couple of weeks, I've done some polls with the states that have 1,000 Cankers disease, and particularly here in the central plant board. But so several states are moving forward with rescinding their quarantines, and some are in that process or moving towards that. So here in the central states, the ones that I'm aware of that are planning to deregulate are Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Missouri, and Wisconsin, and there may be others. But then there's also a few states that have actually filed paperwork, and Michigan and Ohio and Tennessee are states that have actually moved forward with deregulating. So Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Michigan's will be rescinded maybe within the next month or so. Ohio's will be later in the fall, and Tennessee, I think specifically, is September 23rd. So there are states moving forward now with deregulating 1,000 Cankers disease, our state level quarantines. So with that, we'll see if there's any questions or opportunity for discussion.
So Robin, if you would like to come on, but she did let you know, Collin, that is correct in the in the comment section in the chat. And there is another question in the chat for you. So does anyone know what the science says about the why for a sudden reduction in TCD prevalence? If you know the why, it might be easier to support widespread deregulation. Definitely easier to deal with negative public perception with knowledge was the question, comment.
Yeah, Stephen, and others can weigh in on this that are probably more knowledgeable, but I mean, my understanding is, again, this seems to be a climate-driven issue. And so when you have years of really extreme drought in particular regions, it seems like that's when you start seeing the mortality in walnut trees. And I think that was the case in Tennessee, back in 2010, pretty extreme conditions there. And then the following years, pretty adequate moisture, good climate. And so trees were rebounding. So again, it just, there may be other factors involved, but it just seems like a drought-driven, stress-driven issue. And probably also why we primarily just see it in urban areas and not out in managed walnut stands or in native stands of walnut. Love to hear other input on that if anyone else wants to weigh in.
Collin, I'll just add that, when we originally thought of this as a complex, we were thinking, insect and disease. And just to kind of go on a little further, it seems like it's more complex of a complex than just that. So yeah, from an urban standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from taking those trees out of their native range and putting them into the native range, and just a strength of the trees within the native range to fight it off or rebound it. I think it's become a lot more complicated than just a matter of one insect and one pathogen. So, and like you mentioned too, Collin, earlier on, this pathogen as a standalone is probably pretty weak and may not be the lone pathogen that causes mortality. So it's gotten quite complicated, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Yeah,